The room went silent when Trent Caldwell lifted the silver cake server, scooped a thick wedge of vanilla frosting, and pressed it across David Vance's cheek as if the father of the bride were part of the entertainment. "That is the closest you will ever get to luxury," Trent said, laughing toward the investors seated near the dance floor. Grace stood beside him in her wedding gown, pale and frozen. David did not raise his voice. At 40, with a weathered face, close-cropped brown hair, and a plain charcoal suit that fit better than anyone noticed, he simply wiped frosting from his eye and looked at his daughter. Across the ballroom, Naomi Brooks stopped carrying a tray. The 30-year-old African-American maid had warm brown skin, deep-set dark eyes, and natural black hair gathered into a low-braided bun. She wore the same black dress and white collar she used for every private event at the Vance estate, but no one in the hotel knew she was also the only person trusted with David's sealed family records. Trent turned the insult into a speech. He called David a failed contractor, mocked the modest house where Grace believed her father lived, and thanked Evelyn, Grace's mother, for raising her above poverty. Guests laughed uncertainly because Trent was the heir to Caldwell Development, and people often mistook money for permission. Naomi set down the tray and crossed the room. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "you should step away from him." Trent smirked at her uniform. "The help can wait." David finally spoke. "Naomi, not yet." She understood the warning. Inside her service bag was a notarized trust amendment, 3 audit summaries, and a flash drive containing records that could collapse Trent's carefully built image. David had planned to reveal none of it that night. He had attended only because Grace had asked him to be quiet, be humble, and not embarrass her among the Caldwell family. Then Trent reached for another piece of cake. Naomi caught the plate before he could lift it. Her hand was steady. "You have mistaken restraint for weakness," she said. Evelyn stepped forward, embarrassed less by Trent's cruelty than by the possibility of a scene. Grace whispered, "Dad, please just let it go." David looked at the daughter he had protected through 16 years of secrecy. He saw fear in her face, but also a question she had never dared ask. Why had he always lived like a man with nothing? He turned to Naomi. "Bring the envelope," he said. Trent laughed again, yet this time no one joined him. At the edge of the room, Grace's bouquet slipped from her fingers. White roses scattered across the polished floor, and Naomi noticed Trent did not bend to help her gather them. David did. Even with frosting on his face, he knelt, collected every flower, and placed the bouquet back in his daughter's trembling hands. Naomi returned with a cream-colored envelope stamped by a Boston law firm and placed it beside the ruined cake. David did not open it immediately. Instead, he asked Grace whether she wanted the truth in private. Trent answered for her. "There is no truth worth hearing from a man who rents his tuxedo." David's suit was not rented, but he let the lie remain in the air. He had learned that arrogant people often supplied the final evidence against themselves when silence made them nervous. Grace looked from Trent to her father and said, "I want to know." David broke the seal. The first page identified him by his full legal name, Richard David Vance, founder and controlling owner of Vance Urban Holdings, a privately held real estate company whose projects stretched from Massachusetts to Georgia. Newspapers called Richard Vance ruthless because he bought distressed buildings before larger firms recognized their value. Grace knew the name. Everyone did. She did not know it belonged to the man she called Dad. Naomi watched disbelief move through the ballroom. Trent's smile vanished first. Evelyn's face tightened next. David explained only the minimum. He had used his middle name after the divorce, lived in a small inherited house, and removed himself from company publicity. His fortune was held through layered trusts, not to evade law, but to protect Grace from becoming a target for people who valued access more than affection. "You let me think you were struggling," Grace said. "I let you see a life that did not require you to perform for money," he answered. The distinction sounded cold, and he knew it. Naomi saw Grace recoil. She also knew the missing piece. David's secrecy had begun after a kidnapping threat against a business partner's child, though no harm had occurred. He had decided that visibility carried risks he would not place on Grace. Still, Naomi did not reveal it. That was David's truth to tell. Trent recovered enough to change tactics. He wrapped an arm around Grace's shoulder and announced that wealth changed nothing. Then he suggested that David's hidden assets should be transferred into a new marital trust for transparency. Naomi recognized the wording. It matched language in a draft agreement she had found in Trent's guest suite 2 weeks earlier. The document would have given a Caldwell-controlled company authority over Grace's future inheritance. David had asked Naomi to say nothing until he verified who prepared it. Now Trent had spoken the same phrase in public. David slid the envelope toward Grace. Beneath the identity affidavit was a second document, a temporary freeze on any trust amendment bearing Trent's name. "This wedding can continue," David said, "but no financial paper connected to my daughter will move tonight." Trent's hand dropped from Grace's shoulder. "You cannot do that." David met his eyes. "I already did." The guests outside waited, unaware that the marriage had already become an examination of motive. The first consequence arrived before the band resumed. Trent's father's company attorney, present as a guest, left the ballroom without saying goodbye. Within minutes, 2 Caldwell investors followed. Trent tried to frame their departure as respect for privacy, but Naomi had spent years observing the quiet language of wealthy rooms. They were not leaving because of embarrassment. They were leaving because David's name altered the financial risk. Grace asked the hotel manager for a private room, and the 5 of them moved into a wood-paneled library overlooking Boston Harbor. There, David handed Grace the trust freeze and told her she could appoint independent counsel the next morning. He would pay the fees, but would not choose the lawyer. It was the first sign that his control had limits, even when his protection did not. Grace wanted to know how long Naomi had known. 6 years, Naomi answered. Evelyn looked offended. A maid knew before his daughter? Naomi remained composed. "I manage the Vance residence and its confidential household records. I was hired as a maid. I earned broader responsibility." Evelyn dismissed the distinction, and David corrected her. "Naomi is not a servant to be spoken over." The firmness in his voice surprised Grace. It also surprised Naomi, though she did not show it. Their trust had grown through ordinary decisions. Invoices corrected before payment, contractors questioned before access, medication schedules remembered during David's mother's final illness. Nothing between them had been sudden. Trent interrupted. He claimed the marital trust was standard and accused David of sabotaging the wedding to reclaim authority over Grace. That argument found its mark. Grace turned on her father. "You had years to tell me. You waited until tonight because you wanted the room to know you could win." David accepted the accusation because part of it was true. He had planned disclosure only after Naomi discovered irregularities tied to Trent. He had not trusted Grace to see them without the shock of his identity. Naomi stepped between interpretation and fact. She explained that the draft agreement had been found in Trent's suite after he requested garment pressing. It was beneath a hotel folder, not hidden, and she had photographed only the visible first page because it contained Grace's name and the Vance Trust reference. Trent called it theft. Naomi answered that she had immediately reported it to David and deleted the image after his attorney preserved a certified copy. Grace asked to see that copy. David opened his briefcase, then stopped. The signature line carried a handwriting sample that appeared to be Grace's. She stared at it. "I never signed this." Trent said it was only a placeholder. Naomi noticed a faint blue embossing near the notary block, the seal of a financial services office that had closed 3 years earlier. The agreement had not merely been aggressive. It had been manufactured. David photographed the seal beside a ruler, preserving its dimensions before anyone touched the paper again. David had built his company by noticing details other people dismissed. At 23, he had repaired boilers in 4 closed apartment buildings for a regional bank. Rather than take cash for 1 winter of work, he negotiated partial ownership in a vacant 6-unit property whose plumbing had frozen. He lived in the basement, restored 1 apartment at a time, and rented them at fair rates to hospital workers who needed predictable leases. Naomi knew the story because she had organized old tax boxes after David's previous bookkeeper retired. Grace had heard only that her father once worked construction. In the library, David explained how 1 building became 4, then 14, then a network of mixed-income properties. He did not pretend the rise had been noble at every moment. He had pressured sellers, outmaneuvered competitors, and earned the nickname, the broker boss, for controlling negotiations with unnerving patience. But he had never hidden debt, forged consent, or used family as collateral. That distinction was why the false document mattered. Naomi enlarged the photographed embossing on a tablet. The closed office, Beacon Registry Services had once notarized Caldwell development loans. Evelyn said that proved nothing. Trent said old templates were common. Grace asked why her name appeared on a document she had never reviewed. Trent shifted to affection. He told her he had only wanted to simplify their future and that her father was using paperwork to poison the happiest day of her life. The words almost worked. Grace had spent years resenting David's reserve and admiring Trent's confident openness. Naomi then offered the first deeper clue. 3 months earlier, Trent had asked her casual questions about whether David owned the small house outright, whether Grace had a trust, and whether family records were stored on site. He presented the questions as wedding planning. Naomi had answered nothing, but she wrote the date and wording in the household security log. She showed Grace the entry, created long before anyone expected a confrontation. Trent accused her of plotting against him. "A log written before tonight is not a plot," Naomi said. "It is a record." David watched Grace read the entry twice. He wanted to tell her what conclusion to reach, but he stopped himself. Naomi had challenged him that morning. If Grace was to become free of Trent's influence, she also had to become free of David's habit of making choices for her. He now honored that promise. Grace asked for 1 hour before deciding whether the ceremony had any legal meaning to her. She removed Trent's hand from her arm and walked to the window. Outside, harbor lights trembled on dark water. Behind her, Naomi found a second irregularity in the document metadata. The file had been created on a Vance office computer account that did not belong to David. The account had opened the file at 2:14 a.m., copied an old signature image, and exported the agreement 4 minutes later. Someone familiar with the archive had worked quickly. The account belonged to Evelyn. Years earlier, before the divorce, she had worked briefly in Vance Urban Holdings Charitable Foundation and retained an archived login that should have been disabled. David's internal auditors had discovered the dormant account only that week after Naomi reported the draft agreement. No one had yet proved who accessed it, but the metadata connected the false document to a system Evelyn once used. Grace turned from the window and asked her mother for an explanation. Evelyn insisted that old credentials could be copied. David agreed. "That is why we verify before we accuse." It was the first time that night he defended the possibility of her innocence. Naomi recognized the choice for what it was, restraint when retaliation would have been easier. Grace noticed too. She asked David why he had not simply exposed everything before the wedding. He told her he feared she would interpret any warning as jealousy from a father who disliked losing influence. "I was wrong to let fear become secrecy," he said. "Protection without honesty becomes control." The admission changed the room more than the revelation of his fortune. Grace sat down. She did not forgive him, but she listened. David then disclosed the threat that had shaped their lives. When Grace was 8, the child of his business partner had been followed by people seeking leverage in a property dispute. Police intervened before contact occurred, yet David removed his name from public branding, placed Grace's home under her mother's surname, and created the modest identity she knew. He paid tuition through an anonymous scholarship and covered Evelyn's mortgage through a settlement trust, believing distance would keep Grace safe. Evelyn admitted she accepted the arrangement because it provided stability. She also admitted that she later encouraged Grace to see David as financially unreliable, fearing that the truth would reduce her own importance. Grace's expression hardened, but Naomi redirected the moment. "Tonight must be about what can be proved, not every old wound at once." She proposed a practical step: preserve the library, collect the devices voluntarily, and ask the hotel to secure the ballroom camera footage. Trent refused to surrender his phone. David did not threaten him. He told Grace that no one could compel cooperation without legal process, but refusal was information she could consider. Grace looked at Trent and asked one question. "Did you know who my father was before today?" Trent said no. Naomi remembered the seating chart. Trent had personally placed 3 Vance competitors near David's table and instructed the photographer to capture David during the speeches. Humiliation had not been spontaneous. It had been staged for an audience whose identities Trent understood. Grace removed her wedding ring and placed it on the closed document. Grace asked the hotel to keep the ring in its safe and signed a receipt herself. That small act marked the first decision of the evening made without Trent, Evelyn, or David directing her. Trent's calm finally cracked, not through anger but through calculation. He said the ceremony had already occurred and that Grace could not undo a legal marriage by taking off a ring. The officiant, however, had not yet filed the license, and Grace stated that she would seek immediate counsel. Evelyn urged her to avoid scandal. David told Grace that scandal was temporary, while a fraudulent transfer could follow her for decades. Trent then presented his strongest weapon, a series of messages suggesting that David planned to buy Caldwell Development after the wedding and remove Trent from leadership. He claimed David had engineered the entire crisis to weaken a competitor. The messages appeared to come from David's chief financial account. Naomi examined the printouts and felt the room tilt. The language sounded like David, brief, formal, unsentimental. One line mentioned, using the family event as leverage, a phrase that could make his restraint look like strategy. Grace asked him directly whether he had written them. David said no, but the denial was not enough. Naomi knew the account had been compromised once through Evelyn's dormant credentials. She also knew David had authorized a confidential review of Caldwell properties. The false messages blended invented intent with real corporate interest. It was sophisticated because it did not require every detail to be false. Grace stepped away from both men. I do not know who is protecting me and who is using me. That sentence broke something in David. He had built systems to prevent uncertainty, yet his daughter now trusted no one because every adult around her had managed information. Naomi asked everyone to stop arguing. She requested the original files, not printed pages. Trent said they had been emailed anonymously and deleted. Naomi replied that deletion did not erase server records. She also noticed that every message used straight quotation marks, while David's secured email system automatically converted them to typographic marks in exported correspondence. It was not proof, but it was another clue. Trent mocked the observation. Naomi did not react. She asked David whether he would permit an independent forensic firm to review his accounts, even if the report exposed unrelated business plans. He hesitated. The audit could reveal negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Then he looked at Grace. Yes. Naomi asked whether he would also suspend any acquisition involving Caldwell Development until the review ended. Yes. By choosing transparency at real cost, David gave Grace the first reason to believe his denial. Trent offered no equivalent access. Instead, he accused Naomi of manipulating David because she wanted a place in his fortune. The insult landed differently than the first. David answered without calculation. She has a place in my life because she has earned my trust. My money has nothing to do with it. Naomi met his eyes, and for one quiet moment the room understood that their bond was deeper than employment. They left the hotel before midnight with the wedding unresolved and the evidence sealed by an independent attorney Grace selected from a state bar referral list. Over the next 10 days, Naomi and Grace worked side by side in a conference room at Vance Urban Holdings. David gave them access but did not sit at the head of the table. The forensic firm traced the false trust document to a laptop issued to Evelyn during her foundation work and later stored in a Caldwell office. Evelyn admitted she had given the old laptop to Trent after he said he wanted photographs for a wedding tribute. She denied knowing he used it to enter the archived account. Server logs supported part of her statement. Her home network had not accessed the system, while a Caldwell executive network had. The forged messages were created from copied email templates on the same laptop. The final link came from hotel footage. 2 weeks before the wedding, Trent had met a former Beacon Registry clerk in the lobby. Payment records showed a transfer from a Caldwell consulting account to that clerk's new business. The clerk later provided a sworn statement that Trent paid him to recreate an obsolete notary seal and claimed it was for a theatrical property display. He had not known Grace's signature would be added. Each piece had a documented origin, access logs from the Vance server, device records from the forensic image, video authenticated by the hotel's security vendor, and banking records produced under subpoena after Grace filed a civil fraud complaint. The picture was no longer ambiguous. Trent had learned David's identity through the old laptop, planned to gain control of Grace's trust, and staged the wedding humiliation to make David appear unstable if he objected. He also intended to pressure Caldwell investors by circulating images of a supposedly powerless father accepting public ridicule. Naomi discovered one more fact. Trent's company had used similar forged guarantees to secure loans on 3 failing redevelopment projects. That evidence expanded the case beyond a family betrayal. Federal investigators became involved because the transactions crossed state lines. Evelyn agreed to testify in exchange for consideration of her limited role and surrendered all communications. Grace did not excuse her, but she allowed truth to replace guessing. David faced his own consequence. The audit confirmed he had explored buying distressed Caldwell properties, though not the company itself. He disclosed that conflict publicly and withdrew from bidding. It cost him a valuable expansion. Naomi told him the loss was the price of credibility. Then it is worth paying, he said. Their eyes held a second longer than business required. Grace saw it, and, for the first time, did not feel replaced. She saw 2 people choosing honesty when secrecy would have been easier. The court scheduled an evidentiary hearing, and Trent's public image began to unravel before he entered the room. The hearing drew reporters, Caldwell investors, former employees, and wedding guests who had laughed before they understood what they were witnessing. Trent arrived in a navy suit and presented himself as the victim of a billionaire's revenge. David sat in the second row beside Naomi, not at counsel's table. Grace had chosen to lead the complaint in her own name. That decision mattered. It prevented Trent from reducing the case to a contest between powerful men. The prosecutor introduced the trust document first, followed by forensic testimony showing its creation on the archived laptop. A security specialist explained the dormant login and the Caldwell network address. The former registry clerk identified the recreated seal and the payment he received. Hotel footage showed Trent meeting him, then later directing the photographer toward David's table before the cake incident. Finally, Grace testified that she had never reviewed, authorized, or signed the marital trust. Trent's attorney argued that the document was an unfinished planning draft. Naomi's security log contradicted that claim. Her entry recorded Trent asking about trust access months earlier, and a later email showed him sending the forged version to a lender as evidence of future collateral. The lender had relied on it while extending credit to Caldwell Development. That act transformed private manipulation into provable financial fraud. Trent looked toward Evelyn for support, but she testified that he had requested the laptop and coached her to describe David as unstable if questions arose. Her voice shook, yet her account matched preserved messages. The defense then introduced the fake emails attributed to David. The forensic analyst demonstrated that they were assembled from old templates and exported on the same device. David's real email archive showed different server signatures and formatting. No single clue won the case. The strength came from how the clues agreed. During a recess, Trent approached Grace and offered to admit mistakes if she withdrew her testimony. She answered in a voice calm enough for nearby reporters to hear. You did not make one mistake. You built a plan around the belief that everyone near you could be priced, frightened, or embarrassed into silence. David did not speak for her. Naomi did not rescue her. Grace stood on evidence and her own judgment. Months later, Trent pleaded guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud, document fraud, and conspiracy connected to the forged guarantees. The judge imposed a 15-year federal sentence after reviewing the losses, repeated conduct, and abuse of personal trust. Caldwell Development entered court-supervised restructuring. Investors removed the old leadership. In the courthouse corridor, reporters asked David whether he felt vindicated. He looked at Grace before answering. Justice is not humiliation returned. It is the truth given consequences. Naomi heard the sentence and knew he had finally separated power from revenge. The judge also ordered restitution and barred Trent from managing any federally insured development entity after release. For Grace, the sentence was not celebration. It was a boundary made enforceable. The year after the hearing required quieter courage. Grace annulled the marriage, completed financial counseling, and accepted a position with an affordable housing nonprofit that had no business connection to her father. She wanted work that could not be mistaken for inheritance. David respected the boundary, though it meant seeing her less often. Their reconciliation happened through scheduled Sunday breakfasts rather than dramatic apologies. Grace asked hard questions about the hidden tuition payments, the false impression of poverty, and the years David allowed her to misunderstand him. He answered without defending every choice. She admitted that she had judged his clothes, his house, and his silence because Trent and Evelyn taught her to associate polish with worth. Forgiveness arrived in pieces. Evelyn sold the home funded by the old settlement trust, repaid money tied to Trent's scheme, and began supervised cooperation with creditors. Grace remained in contact, but she no longer confused contact with unquestioned trust. David converted one Caldwell property into mixed-income apartments under an independent community board. Because he had withdrawn from the bidding process, the acquisition occurred later through bankruptcy court with full public review. Naomi oversaw tenant transition standards as Director of Residential Integrity, a new executive role approved by the board. She kept her black event dress folded in a drawer, not as a symbol of shame, but as proof that titles had never determined her value. One evening, after the first families moved in, David invited her to the building's rooftop garden. He wore a simple navy coat. Naomi wore a burgundy dress, her braids loose over one shoulder. Boston lights stretched beyond them, softened by spring rain. David told her that he had spent years believing love was another vulnerability to hide behind structures. Naomi answered that secrecy was not safety when it denied another person the right to choose. He agreed. Then he asked, carefully, whether she would consider a life with him beyond work, with separate counsel for her employment contract and no financial pressure attached. Naomi smiled because the awkward precision was entirely his. She said she would consider nothing that treated her as a reward for loyalty, but she would choose a partnership built on truth. He offered his hand, and she took it. Months later, Grace joined them for breakfast at David's small house, which he had decided to keep. There was no announcement, no display, and no attempt to erase the past. Grace apologized to Naomi for once seeing only a uniform. Naomi accepted the apology without pretending it had not hurt. David served coffee in chipped mugs while the three of them discussed a tenant scholarship fund governed by an outside foundation. The fortune remained real, but it no longer controlled the meaning of the room. What mattered was simpler and harder. Humility without disguise, honesty without cruelty, and family defined by the people who stayed when truth required them to change.